At 6:47 a.m. on June 15, 1944, Sergeant Henry Bake Jr. pressed the radio transmitter against his lips as Japanese mortar rounds exploded 40 meters from his position on Saipan Beach. Around him, 8,000 Marines from the 2nd Marine Division fought to advance against fortified Japanese positions that had turned the beach into a slaughterhouse. Bake was 23 years old. He'd grown up on a Navajo reservation in Arizona, where his native language was forbidden in government schools. Navajo children were punished for speaking their own language. Now, that same language was about to save thousands of American lives. He spoke rapidly in Navajo. Dibe ze neshchi tsa azi than zi na. On the other end of the transmission, just 800 meters away, Private First Class Thomas B. Gay translated instantly. Requesting artillery support. Coordinates 234891. Fortified bunker, immediate fire. In 45 seconds, the coordinates were confirmed. In 3 minutes, 155mm shells destroyed the Japanese bunker. Japanese radio operators intercepted every word of that transmission. Their best cryptographers analyzed the recording for 6 hours. They couldn't decipher a single word. During the next 44 months of the Pacific War, the Japanese military would intercept over 100,000 messages from Navajo Code Talkers. They would decipher exactly 0. How did 19 Navajo recruits create the only unbreakable military code of World War II? Hit that like button to find out how this happened. Subscribe for more stories, and let's continue with the story of the Code Talkers. The story begins not in the Pacific, but in California, where one man had an idea that would change the course of the war. An idea so simple yet so revolutionary that military commanders initially dismissed it as impossible. But desperation has a way of making the impossible seem worth trying. And by May 1942, the United States Marine Corps was desperate. May 1942. Camp Elliott, California. Colonel Weathered Woodward faced a problem that was killing Marines across the Pacific: radio communications. Every message transmitted had an 80% chance of being intercepted by Japanese radio operators. American military codes were being broken on average within 72 hours of implementation. At the Battle of Bataan 3 months earlier, Japan had captured intact American cipher machines. Their cryptographers now deciphered tactical messages in real time. American commanders assumed every radio communication was compromised. Officers were dying because the enemy knew their plans before they executed them. The standard solution was physical messengers, runners who carried written orders across battlefields. At the Battle of Guadalcanal, this resulted in delays of 2 to 4 hours in transmitting critical orders. In modern combat, 4 hours meant death. Commanders needed to coordinate artillery strikes, air support, and troop movements in minutes, not hours. But using radio meant giving the enemy your battle plans. It was a deadly paradox. Communicate fast and die. Communicate slowly and die. Woodward needed a code that was impossible to decipher without prior knowledge, fast to encode and transmit, operable under intense enemy fire, and immune to equipment capture. Military cryptographers told him such a code didn't exist. Mathematics could always be reverse engineered. Machines could always be captured. Patterns could always be analyzed. Then Philip Johnston walked into his office with a proposal that would prove them all wrong. Johnston was 50 years old. The son of Protestant missionaries, he'd grown up on the Navajo reservation. He spoke Navajo fluently. He was one of the few non-Navajos in the world who mastered the language. And he understood something that military cryptographers didn't. The best codes aren't built on mathematics. They're built on culture. He brought a simple proposal: use the Navajo language as the basis for military communications. Woodward was skeptical, and with good reason. World War I had tried something similar with Choctaw speakers. It worked temporarily, but the Germans eventually captured Choctaw speakers, forced them to translate messages, and the system collapsed within months. What made Johnston think Navajo would be any different? Johnston explained why Navajo was unlike any language the Axis powers had ever encountered. First, extreme linguistic complexity. Vocal tone determined meaning. 4 different tones. The same word with different tones meant completely different things. Say ma with a high tone, it means mother. Say it with a low tone, it means hand. Say it with a rising tone, it means horse. Say it with a falling tone, it's a question marker. Verbs modified based on subject, object, time, mood, and aspect. A single Navajo verb could have over 356,000 different conjugated forms. English has maybe a dozen forms for most verbs. Navajo had hundreds of thousands. There was no standardized written alphabet. Linguists had attempted to create writing systems for Navajo, but there was no universal standard. No Navajo Japanese or Navajo German dictionaries existed. No textbooks. No grammar guides that could be stolen or captured. The syntactic structure was radically different from Indo-European and Asian languages. Word order, sentence structure, conceptual frameworks, everything was alien to Japanese and German linguistic patterns. Second, population security. Only 30,000 people in the world spoke Navajo. Almost all lived on the Navajo Reservation in Arizona and New Mexico. 0 Navajo speakers lived in Japan or Axis-controlled territories. The Japanese military had thousands of English speakers. They had German speakers. They had Russian speakers. They had 0 Navajo speakers. Even experienced linguists took years to learn basic conversational Navajo. To become fluent enough to understand military communications in real time, that would take decades of immersion in Navajo culture. Johnston had a final argument that convinced Woodward. Colonel, the Navajo language has never been studied by foreign powers because no one considered it worth studying. The language of a conquered people, confined to reservations, forbidden in schools, it's invisible to the world. That makes it the perfect weapon. Woodward gave Johnston 2 weeks to prove the concept. If the demonstration failed, the idea would be abandoned. If it succeeded, it could change the war. Johnston recruited 4 Navajos living near Los Angeles. On May 17, 1942, they demonstrated the system for Marine Corps officers in a test that would determine whether the program lived or died. The test was elegantly simple. Transmit, encode, decode, and deliver 6 typical military messages. Standard radio operators using existing military code would do the same. Time both. Compare results. The messages included artillery coordinates, casualty reports, supply requisitions, and tactical movement orders. Real messages that Marines were sending every day across the Pacific. Messages that were getting men killed when the Japanese intercepted them. The standard code team went first. These were experienced Marine radio men who'd been encoding messages for months. Message 1, encoded in 4 minutes, transmitted in 2 minutes, decoded in 4 minutes. Total, 10 minutes. Message 2, 11 minutes. Message 3, 13 minutes. The process was laborious. Look up each word in a code book. Substitute with the code equivalent. Transmit, receive. Look up each code word. Translate back to English. Deliver. Then the Navajo team demonstrated their method. Message 1, 20 seconds. Message 2, 18 seconds. Message 3, 22 seconds. The Marine officers thought there'd been a mistake. They asked the Navajo team to repeat the demonstration. Same results. Under 25 seconds per message. There was no encoding. There was no decoding. It was direct conversation in Navajo with military terms substituted by Navajo words for animals, birds, and nature. The demonstration continued. Bomb equals ayeshi, egg. Tank equals che-dagahi, turtle. Bomber equals jaysho, buzz. Destroyer equals kalo, shark. Fighter plane equals dahetihi, hummingbird. Each substitution was logical to Navajo speakers, but completely opaque to anyone else. General Clayton Vogel watched the complete demonstration. When the Navajos completed all 6 messages in less than 3 minutes total, while the standard code team was still working on their 4th message, he turned to Woodward with a simple statement. "I want 200 of these men." On May 4, 1942, the Marine Corps authorized recruitment of the first 29 Navajos for the Code Talker program. They would become known as the Original 29, the men who would create the code that would save thousands of lives. But recruiting Navajo men to fight for a country that had spent decades trying to erase their culture presented unique challenges. June 1942, Camp Pendleton, California. The 29 Navajo recruits arrived from reservations in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Their ages ranged from 15 to 35 years old. Many had lied about their ages to enlist. Some were too young, some were too old. All were determined to serve. Among them, Chester Nez, 21 years old, from Chichilta, New Mexico. He'd been sent to boarding school at age 6, where teachers punished him for speaking Navajo. Carl Gorman, 35 years old, already a World War I veteran who'd served in France. John Benally, 18 years old, had been beaten by teachers for speaking Navajo just 3 years earlier. Samuel Billison, 19 years old, had never seen the ocean, never seen a city, never been off the reservation. They faced an immediate and unprecedented challenge. The Marine Corps had no Navajo vocabulary for modern military terms. The Navajo language had evolved over centuries in the southwestern desert. It had words for desert animals, plants, weather, traditional warfare. It had no words for aircraft carrier, machine gun, hand grenade, howitzer, amphibious assault, or naval bombardment. The recruits needed to create an entirely new military vocabulary in Navajo without making it obvious or predictable to enemy cryptographers. If they simply borrowed English words, Japanese linguists might eventually recognize them. If they created random substitutions, Navajo speakers themselves wouldn't be able to remember them under combat stress. The solution had to be intuitive to Navajo speakers, but incomprehensible to everyone else. The original 29 gathered in a wooden hut at Camp Pendleton. No officers present, no linguists, no cryptographers. Just 29 Navajo men tasked with weaponizing their own language. They had 3 objectives: create Navajo words for over 200 military terms, ensure the words were memorable for Navajo speakers, ensure they were completely unintelligible to non-speakers. They developed 3 interlocking systems, each adding another layer of security to the code. System 1, association with nature. They linked military equipment to animals or natural elements that shared characteristics. This wasn't random. Each association made logical sense to Navajo speakers, but would seem like gibberish to anyone else. Fighter plane equals da-he-ti-he, hummingbird. Why? Because both are small, fast, agile, darting. Bomber equals J-show, buzzard. Why? Large, slow, ominous, circling. Aircraft carrier equals Tsidi Mofa Yehi, bird carrier, a floating platform where birds land. Submarine equals Beshlo, ironfish, a fish made of metal that swims underwater. Tank equals Che Dagahi, tortoise. Hard shell, slow movements, heavily armored. Each word made perfect sense if you understood Navajo conceptual frameworks. Each word was utterly meaningless if you didn't. System 2, literal description. They described the object's function in Navajo rather than naming it directly. Grenade equals Nima-si, potatoes. Why? Because grenades were round like potatoes and you threw them. Machine gun equals Akna Azdoni, gun that talks rapidly. Flamethrower equals Ko-a-gi-a-hitso, big fire thrower. Depth charge equals Toka-yazihai, water barrel that explodes. System 3, military phonetic alphabet. For words that needed to be spelled out precisely, names, codes, specific technical terms, they created an alphabet where each letter corresponded to a Navajo word. A equals Wallachi, ant. B equals shush, bear. C equals moasi, cat, D equals B, deer, E equals dze, elk, F equals mai, fox, G equals klizzy, goat, and so on through all 26 letters. But they added a critical security feature. To prevent frequency analysis, where enemies identify patterns based on which letters appear most frequently in English, they created multiple words for the most common letters. E, the most common letter in English, could be dze, elk, or ahja, ear, or ahna, eye. T could be thanzi, turkey, or awo, tooth, or tlagin, ice. This meant that even if Japanese cryptographers somehow obtained a partial key to the alphabet code, frequency analysis would show seemingly random distribution of letters, making decryption impossible. The complete code consisted of 211 military vocabulary terms, 26 primary alphabet words, and 17 alternate alphabet words. A total of 254 terms that had to be memorized perfectly. And here's what made the Navajo Code truly revolutionary. There was no written material, no manual, no codebook, no reference guide that could be captured or stolen. Everything existed only in the minds of the code talkers. The recruits spent 13 weeks in the most intensive memorization training the Marine Corps had ever conducted. They practiced 14 hours per day, 7 days per week. Test after test after test. Any hesitation, any error, any forgotten word meant elimination from the program. Why such extreme standards? Because in combat, hesitation meant death. Messages had to be transmitted instantly under mortar fire, artillery bombardment, sniper attacks, and the chaos of battle. A code talker who paused to remember a word while calling in artillery support could cause friendly fire casualties or allow enemy forces to overrun American positions. Chester Nez described the training later. "We dreamed in code. We woke up speaking code. Every casual conversation became practice. If someone said, 'pass the salt' at dinner, we'd translate it to code in our heads. We couldn't forget a single word. Our lives and the lives of every Marine around us would depend on perfect recall under the worst conditions imaginable." The training wasn't just memorization. They practiced under simulated combat conditions. Instructors detonated explosives near their positions. They had to encode and transmit messages while smoke grenades filled the air. They worked in extreme heat, extreme cold, after 48 hours without sleep, because that's what combat would demand. They also trained on radio equipment. Navajo men from remote reservations had to master technology most had never seen before. Radio theory, frequency selection, antenna setup, signal strength, atmospheric conditions affecting transmission. They had to become not just code talkers, but expert radio operators. Of the 29 original recruits, 10 were eliminated during training. The reasons varied. Inability to memorize the code completely, failure to maintain transmission speed under stress, medical problems discovered during physical training, psychological issues that made them unsuitable for combat. 19 men completed the training. 19 men who could speak the Unbreakable code fluently, automatically, under any conditions. September 1942. Before deploying the code talkers in combat, the Marine Corps conducted one final test, a test that would either validate the entire program or prove it was a waste of time and resources. They simulated realistic battle conditions, explosions, smoke, noise, shouted instructions, total chaos. The code talkers had to transmit 10 complex messages without error while training sergeants detonated explosives 15 meters away, fired weapons overhead, and created as much confusion as possible. The messages included requesting artillery support with specific coordinates, reporting enemy positions and strength, ordering tactical troop movements, coordinating airstrikes, casualty reports with medical supply requisitions. All 19 code talkers passed. Average transmission time per message, 22 seconds. Error rate, 0. But there was one final test that no one expected, a test that would prove whether the code was truly unbreakable. A Marine Corps intelligence officer, without informing the code talkers, recorded their transmissions during the final training exercise. He compiled 2 hours of recordings containing dozens of complete military messages. He then sent these recordings to the best American military cryptographers at Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Washington, D.C. These weren't just any cryptographers. These were the same experts who had broken Japanese naval codes, including the famous JN-25 code that had given America advance warning of Japanese operations. They had deciphered German Enigma messages. They had broken Italian naval codes. They were the best code breakers America had. The challenge: can you break this code? You have access to all the resources of American military intelligence. You can work as long as you need. Break the code. 30 cryptographers worked for 3 weeks. They applied every technique known to modern cryptography: frequency analysis, pattern recognition, statistical distribution analysis. They looked for repeated phrases. They looked for grammatical structures. They attempted to identify the language family. After 3 weeks, they produced their report. The conclusion was both simple and devastating. They couldn't decipher a single word. One senior cryptographer wrote in his detailed analysis, "This is not a code in the traditional sense. It is an unknown language used to substitute another language with additional layers of substitution within that language. Without native speakers or reference dictionaries, and given the tonal nature of the language which cannot be accurately transcribed, it is mathematically impossible to decipher within any usable time period. Even if we identified the base language, we would still need to break the substitution code within that language. This is a 2-layer cipher, where the first layer is an entire natural language. We estimate that breaking this code would require years of study and access to native speakers. In tactical military timeframes, this code is unbreakable." The report continued with a recommendation: "Deploy immediately. This is the most secure tactical communication system we have ever encountered. If the enemy faces the same challenges we faced, they will be unable to decipher these messages even with unlimited resources and time." The Marine Corps declared the code operational. In October 1942, the first code talkers shipped out to the South Pacific. Their destination: Guadalcanal, where American Marines were fighting one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. None of them knew if the code would work under real combat conditions. They were about to find out. November 7th, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The first 6 code talkers arrived on the island in the midst of the Battle of Guadalcanal. The battle was in its 4th month, and it wasn't going well. American Marines had captured Henderson Field, the only airstrip on the island, but they were barely holding on. The Japanese Navy bombarded the field every night with battleships and cruisers, turning the airstrip into a cratered moonscape. Japanese bombers attacked during the day. Japanese ground forces launched night attacks trying to recapture the field. Marines were dying from disease, malnutrition, and constant combat. The strategic situation was desperate. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled Guadalcanal. Whoever controlled Guadalcanal controlled the Solomon Islands. Whoever controlled the Solomons controlled the sea lanes to Australia. If Henderson Field fell, the entire Pacific campaign could collapse. The code talkers were assigned to different units around the American defensive perimeter. 2 men per unit, 1 to transmit, 1 to receive. This redundancy was critical. If one code talker was killed or wounded, the other could continue operations. Among them, Henry Bake Jr., assigned to the 5th Marines; John Benally, assigned to Communications Headquarters; Chester Nez, assigned to an artillery battalion. Frontline commanders were skeptical about these new arrivals. They'd heard rumors about a special code, but assumed it was exaggerated. Most combat officers had seen too many rear-echelon innovations that failed under fire. They'd use the code talkers if ordered to, but they didn't expect much. On the first night, everything changed. November 8, 1942. 2:34 a.m. The date and time would be recorded in Marine Corps history. Japanese forces launched a major night attack against the southern sector of Henderson Field perimeter. Intelligence estimated approximately 900 Japanese soldiers advancing through the jungle under cover of darkness. The attack was part of a coordinated offensive designed to overwhelm American defenses and recapture the airfield. Lieutenant Robert Kriendler commanded Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, positioned in the direct path of the Japanese assault. His company consisted of 186 Marines, exhausted from weeks of combat, low on ammunition, and facing an enemy force 5 times their size. At 2:37 a.m., Japanese forces hit Kriendler's lines with overwhelming force. Machine gun fire, mortar rounds, bayonet charges. Within minutes, Kriendler realized his company was about to be overrun. He needed reinforcements immediately. Without support, Fox Company would be annihilated. Standard procedure: encode the message using military code, transmit to headquarters, wait for the message to be decoded, wait for command to make a decision, wait for the response to be encoded and transmitted back. Estimated time: 8 to 12 minutes. Kriendler didn't have 8 minutes. He probably didn't have 4 minutes. Japanese soldiers were already inside his defensive perimeter. He turned to Henry Bake Jr., the Navajo Code Talker attached to his unit. "Use your code. Now." Bake grabbed the transmitter. Around him, bullets cracked through the air. Mortar rounds exploded 30 meters away, throwing up dirt and shrapnel. Marines were shooting, shouting, dying. Bake pressed the transmitter against his lips and spoke rapidly in Navajo. The transmission lasted 45 seconds. To Japanese radio operators listening on the same frequency, it sounded like incomprehensible gibberish. To John Benally, the code talker at the receiving station 3 kilometers away at division headquarters, every word was crystal clear. Benally translated instantly and delivered the message to the communications officer. "South sector under heavy attack. Approximately 900 hostiles advancing from grid coordinates 145-890. Fox Company in danger of being overrun. Request immediate reinforcement, 2 companies minimum. Request artillery support at coordinates 149-895 to disrupt enemy staging area. Situation critical. Immediate response required." The communications officer handed the message to the duty commander. Total time from Bake's transmission to the message being on the commander's desk: 3 minutes. The commander issued orders immediately. 2 reserve companies were dispatched. Artillery batteries received fire missions. The Marine Corps moved with a speed that hadn't been possible before. Reinforcements arrived at Fox Company's position in 11 minutes. Artillery began falling on Japanese staging areas in 4 minutes, disrupting their attack and causing confusion in their ranks. The Japanese assault, which should have overrun Fox Company in 15 minutes, stalled. Reinforcements stabilized the line. By dawn, the attack had been completely repelled. American casualties: 12 killed, 27 wounded. Without the rapid response enabled by the Code Talkers, estimated casualties would have been 60 to 80 killed, over 100 wounded, and possible loss of the entire sector. Kriendler wrote in his after-action report, "The speed of communication provided by the Navajo Code Talkers saved my company and possibly prevented a breakthrough that could have compromised Henderson Field. I estimate we would have lost 40 to 60 men without rapid reinforcements. The code worked flawlessly under extreme combat conditions. Word spread rapidly through the division. The code wasn't propaganda, it was real, and it worked." During the next 6 weeks at Guadalcanal, the Code Talkers transmitted over 800 messages. These included artillery coordinates for hundreds of fire missions, troop movement orders coordinating battalion-level operations, intelligence reports on enemy positions and strength, medical evacuation requests, supply requisitions, tactical updates during active combat. 0 messages were deciphered by the Japanese. 0 messages contained errors that resulted in friendly fire or misdirected operations. Japanese radio operators intercepted most of these transmissions. They recorded them. They sent them to cryptography units in Rabaul and Tokyo. Analysts studied them intensively. They recognized it was a code. They couldn't break it. They couldn't even identify what language family it belonged to. But the code talkers faced an unexpected and deadly problem that had nothing to do with the enemy. The problem was friendly fire from American soldiers. The issue was identification. In the chaos of jungle warfare, Navajo Code Talkers speaking their native language were frequently mistaken for Japanese soldiers by their own troops. Several Code Talkers were nearly shot by American sentries who heard a foreign language in the darkness and assumed they were enemy infiltrators. In one incident, Chester Nez was transmitting from a forward position at night when an American patrol heard him speaking Navajo. They surrounded his position with weapons drawn, convinced he was a Japanese soldier using a radio. Only the intervention of his unit commander, who physically placed himself between Nez and the patrol, prevented a fatal shooting. The Marine Corps quickly implemented a new policy. Each code talker would be assigned a personal bodyguard. This bodyguard's primary job wasn't to protect the code talker from Japanese forces. It was to protect him from American forces and to ensure the code never fell into enemy hands. These bodyguards, usually white Marines from various parts of the country, received explicit and chilling orders. Stay with your code talker at all times. Protect him from friendly fire incidents. If the code talker is about to be captured by Japanese forces, kill him. The code cannot fall into enemy hands under any circumstances. Chester Nez later recalled his bodyguard, a young Marine from Texas named Bill McClelland. Bill told me straight up, no emotion, "Nez, if the Japanese get close to capturing you, I'm gonna shoot you first. My orders are clear. The code is more important than either of our lives." He wasn't being cruel. He wasn't joking. He was stating a fact. And I understood. We all understood. We were weapons, valuable weapons. And weapons can't be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The bodyguards took their responsibilities seriously. Several code talkers later reported that their bodyguards were more paranoid about their safety than they were themselves. The bodyguards screened everyone who approached. They memorized faces of Marines in their units to prevent infiltration. They slept lightly, if at all. The war in the Pacific was escalating. Guadalcanal was just the beginning. The code talkers would deploy to every major battle in the Pacific campaign. Tarawa, where Marines suffered 3,000 casualties in 76 hours. Peleliu, where the battle lasted 2 months instead of 4 days. Saipan, where Japanese forces launched the largest banzai charge of the war. Guam, Tinian, and eventually Iwo Jima. The bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, where the Japanese military would make their most determined effort to break the Navajo Code. December 1944, Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Army Intelligence Headquarters. While American forces advanced across the Pacific, Japanese military intelligence faced a growing crisis. They were losing the war, and they couldn't understand why their enemies knew so much. Colonel Takeo Yamazaki commanded the cryptanalysis section of Imperial Army Intelligence. His office walls were covered with maps showing American advances across the Pacific. Each battle, each island, each defeat pointed to the same conclusion. Somehow, American forces were coordinating operations with impossible speed and precision. Japanese forces intercepted American radio communications constantly. They recorded thousands of transmissions. Most used standard military codes that Japanese cryptographers could break within hours or days. But there was another type of transmission. Transmissions in an unknown language that appeared during every major American operation. Yamazaki had been tracking these transmissions for over 2 years. His analysts had assembled a substantial database. They knew several critical facts. First, the transmissions appeared in all major American battles: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu. Wherever Americans fought, these mysterious transmissions appeared. Second, the transmission speed suggested natural language, not machine-generated code. The speakers weren't pausing to look up words in code books or to perform mathematical encryption. They were speaking fluidly, conversationally. Third, Phonetic analysis indicated a Native American language structure. The sounds, the patterns, the tonal qualities didn't match English, Spanish, or any European language. They didn't match Asian languages either. Yamazaki consulted linguists at Tokyo Imperial University. They analyzed recorded transmissions for weeks. Their conclusion: the language belonged to the Athabascan family, a group of Native American languages from northwestern North America. But they couldn't identify which specific language. The Athabascan family included dozens of languages: Apache, Navajo, Chippewayan, Hupa, and many others. Each was distinct. Each had different vocabulary, different grammar structures, different tonal systems. Without knowing which language it was, breaking the code was impossible. Yamazaki needed a native speaker, someone who could listen to the transmissions and identify the language. Then, perhaps, that speaker could translate the messages. The problem: where do you find a Native American language speaker in Japan during World War II? For months, Yamazaki's staff searched through prisoner of war records. They were looking for any American soldier from southwestern United States who might speak a Native American language. The search seemed hopeless. Then, in January 1945, they found one: Private Joe Kiyumiya, serial number 3985641, captured in the Philippines in April 1942. Place of birth: Lukachukai, Arizona. Ethnicity listed as Native American. Kiyumiya had survived 3 years in Japanese prisoner of war camps. He'd endured starvation, disease, forced labor, and routine beatings. He weighed 95 pounds. He had dysentery, malaria, and beriberi. He should have been dead. Instead, Japanese intelligence brought him to Tokyo in chains. January 20th, 1945. A basement room in the Imperial Army Intelligence Building. Kiyumiya sat in a chair, malnourished and exhausted. Through an interpreter, Colonel Yamazaki explained what he wanted. Yamazaki placed headphones over Kiyumiya's ears and played a recorded transmission from Saipan. The transmission lasted 2 minutes. Kiyumiya listened without expression. "Do you understand this language?" Yamazaki asked through the interpreter. Kiyumiya listened to several more transmissions. He heard words he recognized: Ze, Moasi, Shush, B. He knew these words. They were Navajo, but the sentences made no sense. The speakers were saying things like elk, cat, bear, deer, turtle, buzzard. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't anything coherent. "It's Navajo," Kiyumiya finally answered. "My language. But the words don't make sense. They're saying animal names, but not in any pattern I understand. It's like someone is just listing random animals. I don't know what it means." Yamazaki pressed him. "You speak this language?" "Yes. I grew up speaking Navajo." "Then you can translate these messages." "No. I can identify some words, but the sentences don't have meaning. It's not normal Navajo conversation." Yamazaki didn't understand what he was hearing. He had a native Navajo speaker. He had clear recordings of Navajo transmissions. Why couldn't the speaker translate them? What Yamazaki didn't realize was that he was listening to 2 layers of code, not one. The first layer was the Navajo language itself, incomprehensible to non-speakers. The second layer was the substitution code within Navajo, where military terms were replaced with animal names and natural elements. Even a Navajo speaker couldn't translate the messages without knowing the specific military vocabulary the code talkers had created. And that vocabulary existed nowhere, except in the memories of the code talkers themselves. Yamazaki spent 3 weeks trying to extract useful information from Kiyumiya. He offered better food. He offered medical treatment. When that didn't work, he used harsher methods: interrogation, sleep deprivation, beatings. Kiyumiya couldn't translate the messages because he genuinely didn't know the code. You can't torture information out of someone who doesn't possess that information. One afternoon, in frustration, Yamazaki played a transmission and demanded Kiyumiya translate it word by word. Kiyomiya, half delirious from starvation and exhaustion, tried to explain, "The words are Navajo, but they're using them wrong. He's saying ironfish, whale, iron turtlebird nest. That's not a sentence. That's just words. Maybe it's some kind of code using Navajo words, but I don't know what the words stand for." That was the closest anyone in Japanese intelligence came to understanding the system. They realized it was a code within a language, but without the key, without knowing which Navajo words corresponded to which military terms, the code remained unbreakable. Yamazaki eventually gave up. Kiyomiya was sent back to a prisoner of war camp in brutal conditions. When American forces liberated the camp in August 1945, Kiyomiya weighed 84 pounds. He was one of the few survivors. The Japanese military never broke the Navajo Code. Not even close. February 1945. USS El Dorado, flagship of the Fifth Fleet, 3 days before the invasion of Iwo Jima. The Battle of Iwo Jima would become the bloodiest in Marine Corps history. Intelligence estimates indicated 21,000 Japanese defenders entrenched in a network of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions across the volcanic island. The American plan was straightforward in concept, but brutal in execution. Land 3 Marine divisions, 70,000 men, on beaches dominated by Japanese artillery. Fight uphill against an enemy that had spent 8 months fortifying every cave, every ravine, every inch of volcanic rock. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had designed a defense specifically to maximize American casualties. His orders to his troops: "We must fight to the death. Every man will kill 10 Americans before dying." 40 code talkers were assigned to the Iwo Jima operation, the largest number ever deployed in a single battle. They knew the battle would depend on communication, coordinating naval artillery from dozens of ships, directing airstrikes from hundreds of aircraft, moving 6 infantry regiments, 3 artillery battalions, tank units, and support elements through chaotic terrain while under constant fire. What the code talkers didn't know was that Japanese intelligence had made breaking their code a top priority. They'd failed, but they would continue trying throughout the battle. February 19th, 1945, D-Day at Iwo Jima. At 8:59 a.m., the first wave of Marines hit the beaches. They encountered minimal resistance initially. The volcanic sand made movement difficult. Marines struggled to climb up from the beach, weighed down with equipment, sinking into the loose black sand with every step. Then the Japanese opened fire, machine guns firing from concealed positions in the volcanic rock. Mortars dropping rounds with precision from pre-plotted coordinates. Artillery from positions on Mount Suribachi and the highlands overlooking the beaches. The fire came from everywhere and nowhere, enemies invisible in their fortified positions. Marines were cut down before they could even establish a defensive line. The beach turned into a killing ground. Bodies piled up at the waterline. Wounded men couldn't be evacuated because the beach was still under fire. Landing craft were destroyed as they approached shore. Code talkers landed with the first assault waves. They carried their radio equipment through chest-deep water, under fire, up the beach. They established communication posts in whatever cover they could find. Crater holes, destroyed landing craft, piles of equipment. During the first 6 hours of battle, while Marines fought desperately to move inland from the beach, the code talkers transmitted over 800 messages. These messages coordinated naval artillery strikes from 7 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. Over 800 individual fire missions in the first day. Bombing runs from 64 aircraft of various types. Close air support missions that destroyed Japanese artillery positions and bunkers. Movement orders for 6 infantry battalions trying to advance through murderous fire. Medical evacuation requests for over 500 wounded in the first 12 hours. Every message was transmitted in Navajo. Every message was delivered accurately. Every message was completely incomprehensible to Japanese interceptors who were listening to every frequency. The battle continued for 36 days. 36 days of close-quarters combat in tunnels and caves. 36 days of fighting for every yard of volcanic rock. 36 days where communication meant the difference between life and death. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signals officer, supervised communications throughout the battle. He later made a statement that would become famous. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Connor elaborated in his official report. During the first 48 hours of the operation, the Code Talkers transmitted and received over 800 messages without error. At the height of the battle, when multiple operations were occurring simultaneously across the island, we had 6 Navajo nets operating around the clock. The speed, accuracy, and security of their transmissions gave us an operational advantage that cannot be overstated. The Japanese were blind and deaf to our communications, while we coordinated complex operations in real time. The statistics from Iwo Jima told the story. Total Code Talker transmissions during the 36-day battle, over 5,000 messages. Errors resulting in friendly fire or misdirected operations, 0. Messages decoded by Japanese intelligence, 0. American casualties in the battle, 6,821 killed, 19,217 wounded. Without the secure, rapid communications provided by the Code Talkers, military historians estimate casualties would have been 30 to 40% higher. That means the Navajo Code Talkers directly saved between 2,000 and 3,000 American lives at Iwo Jima alone. The battle for Iwo Jima ended on March 26, 1945. The island was secured. The airfield that had been the objective of the entire operation was now in American hands. B-29 bombers damaged over Japan would have a place to make emergency landings. Fighter escorts could accompany bombers all the way to Tokyo. The Code Talkers packed their equipment and prepared for the next operation. They would deploy to Okinawa in April. They would continue transmitting until the war ended in August. Throughout the Pacific War, approximately 400 Navajo Code Talkers served in the Marine Corps. They participated in every major Marine operation from 1942 to 1945. They transmitted over 100,000 messages. The Japanese military intercepted thousands of these transmissions. They assigned their best cryptographers to break the code. They captured a Navajo-speaking prisoner and tried to force him to translate. They deciphered exactly 0 messages. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The Code Talkers, like millions of other American servicemen, prepared to return home. But their homecoming was unlike any other. Most veterans could talk about their experiences. They could tell their families about the battles they'd fought, the places they'd seen, the dangers they'd faced. The Code Talkers couldn't say anything. The program remained classified, top secret. The Marine Corps informed the Code Talkers that they were forbidden from discussing their service, their code, or anything related to the program. The reason? The code might be used again. Future wars might require the same unbreakable communication system. If enemies learned how it worked, the advantage would be lost. So the Code Talkers went home in silence. They returned to reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. Many returned to the same poverty, the same discrimination, the same government policies that had tried to erase their language and culture. Many returned to find that they still weren't allowed to vote in state elections. Arizona and New Mexico didn't grant Native Americans full voting rights until 1948. They'd fought for a country that didn't recognize them as full citizens. They returned to schools where Navajo children were still punished for speaking their native language. The same language that had saved thousands of American lives was still officially forbidden in Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. Chester Nez returned to New Mexico and worked as a janitor and painter. He couldn't tell his family that he'd been instrumental in winning the Pacific War. John Benally worked in construction. Henry Bake Jr. worked odd jobs on the reservation. Carl Gorman became an artist. They couldn't tell anyone what they'd done. Not their wives, not their children, not their friends. They carried the secret for 23 years. The classification lasted until 1968. In 1968, the Department of Defense finally declassified the Code Talker program. By then, many Code Talkers had died. Others were in their 60s and 70s. Some had waited so long to tell their stories that their own families didn't believe them at first. Recognition came slowly, grudgingly, decades late. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. It was a symbolic gesture, but it meant something to the aging Code Talkers who'd waited 40 years for acknowledgement. In 2000, Congress passed legislation authorizing congressional gold medals for the original 29 Code Talkers who had created the code. Gold medals were also authorized for the other Code Talkers who had served. The medals were presented in a ceremony at the Capitol in 2001. Only 5 of the original 29 were still alive to receive their medals in person. The others received posthumous recognition. Chester Nez, the last surviving member of the original 29, lived until 2014. He died on June 4th, at age 93, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Before his death, he finally broke his silence completely. He wrote a memoir. He gave speeches. He told the story that he'd been forbidden to tell for 23 years. In an interview shortly before his death, Nez reflected on the code and its impact. "We took pride in our language. The white men tried to take it away from us in school. They said it was savage, that it had no value. Then when America needed help, they came to us and asked us to use that same language to fight a war. That's irony. That's the Navajo story. Our language saved lives. That's all that matters." The Navajo Code proved something that cryptography experts had considered impossible: that a code based entirely on natural language could be unbreakable. Every previous military code had relied on mathematics, cipher machines, or symbol substitution. All of those could eventually be broken through statistical analysis, equipment capture, or computational brute force. The Navajo Code was different. It wasn't mathematics. It was culture. The United States government had spent decades trying to eradicate the Navajo language. Government schools punished children for speaking it. Federal policies encouraged forced assimilation and cultural erasure. The goal was to make Native Americans abandon their languages and adopt English exclusively. Then, when America needed an unbreakable code, it discovered it had accidentally created one by preserving a language in the hearts and minds of people who refused to let it die. 19. Navajo recruits used their native language, the language they'd been punished for speaking, to create the only truly invulnerable cryptographic weapon of World War II. They proved that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. They proved that diversity isn't just a social good, it's a strategic advantage. They proved that what makes people different can make a nation stronger. Most importantly, they proved that a language governments tried to silence would become the voice that saved thousands of lives. Military historians estimate the Navajo Code reduced American casualties by 30 to 40% in Pacific battles where it was used extensively. Across all operations from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, that equals approximately 7,000 to 9,000 American lives saved directly because of Code Talker communications. 7,000 to 9,000 fathers who came home, sons who lived to have families, brothers who survived the war, all because 19 Navajo men turned their language into a weapon. That's the story of the Navajo Code Talkers, how 19 men created a code that 100,000 messages couldn't break. If stories like this remind you why we preserve history, hit that like button. Subscribe for more forgotten heroes. Turn on that notification bell so you never miss these stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the Pacific Theater. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.